We should consider the impacts we make to the abyssal plain permanent. They're very stable over centuries to millennium. All of the biologic and ecologic and geologic processes on abyssal plains are slow. Impacts to the seafloor, we're likely not going to see them recover pre-impact state.
Welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining podcast. I'm Eric Young. Joining me today is Dr. Andrew Thaler. Andrew is a deep sea ecologist and technologist who focuses on how human activity and technology intersect with remote marine ecosystems. He leads Blackbeard Biologic and is affiliated with the universities of Delaware and Maryland. Andrew is known for his open source ocean tools like OpenCTD and his activity on the popular South Infrared Science blog. Andrew, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so there's a million things that I think you are capable of speaking on in terms of the deep sea mining conversation. I invited you on now a little bit instigated by your recent testimony to the U.S. Congress, which I thought was interesting and worthwhile and kind of a good grounding for a conversation at any rate. Can you start introducing yourself to people who maybe don't know what are you all about?
Sure thing. So I am a deep sea ecologist, I'm a conservation technologist, and I'm an ocean science educator. I've been working in the deep sea mining field in various capacities since about 2008 when I did environmental baseline work for Nautilus Minerals on the Saguaro 1 project. So I have been involved in doing primary research on the environmental impacts of deep sea mining. I've also been involved on the policy side of things, advising NGOs and government organizations, as well as UN agencies about potential impacts and particularly knowledge gaps. I've also been the editor-in-chief of the Deep Sea Mining Observer, which was a trade journal that the Pew Charitable Trusts created to track the development of the deep sea mining industry. I was the editor-in-chief for 4 years until the grant for that was, came to the end of its natural life. It always had a planned end date. So I have been engaged in deep sea mining in probably about as many capacities as you can be engaged in deep sea mining. I've worked with mining companies. I've worked with NGOs. I've worked with government agencies. I've worked with the UN. Probably the only agency I haven't worked with directly is the ISA. So I've been pretty heavily involved in various capacities of the industry for almost 20 years now, which is, it hurts my heart to say a little bit.
And no kidding. How did you get from starting out in research and what drew you to doing science communication, ocean education, and these other hats that you wear? Why didn't you just kind of stay in the research lane?
I never really started in science communication or decided to become a science communicator. It's always been, I've always seen it as part of the job as a scientist to share what we learn about the world with the general public. As a scientist, you're not serving the public if you're just doing research quietly by yourself and publishing papers and keeping everything locked within the ivory tower. There's a duty to share our knowledge with the world, and especially when you're working in the deep sea. Even beyond any of the issues with deep sea mining, the deep sea is just such a cool place. It is the weirdest ecosystems on the planet, and so how can you not want to share the glory of the hagfish or the wonders of a whale fall with the general public?
Tell me about OpenCTD. What's the idea behind that and why?
So OpenCTD is a project that started when I was a postdoctoral researcher at Duke University. I was working with a colleague of mine, Kersey Sturdivant, who did WormCam, which was a benthic imaging system to look at seasonal changes in benthic communities, so animals that are living beneath the sediment. And we had a need for a bunch of CTDs for one of our research projects.
What's a CTD?
So a CTD is an oceanographic instrument that measures conductivity, which is salinity, temperature, and depth. It gives you the basic parameters you need to measure a body of water. And pretty much any marine scientific research conducted anywhere in the world in any discipline almost always begins with a CTD cast. Quantify what's going on in the water column that you're working in. The problem with CTDs is that they're very expensive. The cheap handheld units that you can find in a lot of coastal ecology labs can cost up to $7,000, and they very quickly climb to the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that becomes a barrier for a lot of communities that want to study the ocean, for a lot of communities that changes in the ocean are directly affecting them. Um, if you want to study climate change, if you want to study sea level rise, if you want to understand what's happening with runoff or stormwater in your community, you need a CTD. And if you're not affiliated with a major academic institution, often that can be cost prohibitive. So we got an idea in our head that we could build a DIY CTD for significantly cheaper than the commercially available handheld units. And the handheld units are for coastal work. They're good to about 100 meters. They have a very high level of accuracy. They're not deep sea equipment per se, but they do kind of complement any sort of coastal or estuarine work, or even freshwater work at this point. We were a little bit ambitious. We were both ecologists, not engineers. And so diving into this idea that we could just build a CTD was a much, much bigger project than we thought it would be at the outset. And that's fine. I mean, when you're in your early 20s and full of confidence is the right time to dive into absolute nonsense projects and see how far you can get. So it took us about 10 years to get to the point where we had an oceanographic instrument that you could build yourself. So the idea behind it was always that the end user would be the one to build their own CTDs. And that was really the cost saving feature of the whole thing, is that you're now outsourcing the cost of labor to the end user rather than manufacturing it. But also having it be a DIY package meant that you could run it in like student applications. You could do classroom activities. You could teach kids how to solder and do electronics. So it took us 10 years to get to that point. And in about 2020 to 2019, we had an instrument that we were then confident was as good as the most readily available handheld units. And we've been testing it for 5 or 6 years now, and it has held up to that assessment. We've published a few papers doing direct comparisons. We've run workshops around the world, and we've really kind of created this community of I don't want to say DIY oceanographers because they are just oceanographers, but community oceanographers who aren't affiliated with formal research institutions, that now have the tools to study their own ecosystems, to study their own waterways. And depending on what is currently happening with the U.S. tariffs, which has been variable week to week for the last year and a little bit of a nightmare for anyone who's sourcing electronic components, you can currently build your own open CTD for about $350. So an order of magnitude cheaper than the next available commercial unit.
And this is just open source instructions out there on the web somewhere.
It's 100% open source. You can get access to all of it through oceanographyforeveryone.com. We do sell kits with a significant markup for people who want to just get the kit and not source everything themselves, but I usually encourage everyone to do their own sourcing. So the bill of materials is freely available. Software is freely available. There's a couple custom circuit boards that we have to print that the schematics for are freely available. So if you can cut your own boards or order them yourself, you can. Or if you need one, you can send me an email and I'll usually send you one if I have any in stock. But the idea is to get as many oceanographic instruments into the hands of people working in communities directly affected by our changing oceans as possible.
Do you follow up on what's being done with them? Like, do you have some kind of a repository of the data that comes out of all of those? Or
So I do follow up. We have done some data repositories. We had a program where we partnered with whale watching boats out of New England. And so every time they observed a whale, they also did a CTD cast. And so we collected all of that data for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in the United States. But part of our open source and DIY and independent commitment is that we want the end users to have ownership over their data. So data ownership is very important to us, and ensuring that it's the communities that own their data and get to decide what's done with it. So we don't have like a centralized repository where you would be required to deposit information. If you build a CTD, it's your CTD to do with as you want. And to do with the data as you want, because there are issues in some communities where sharing data may be not the most ideal situation for them. And there are places where people are working. I worked with a couple of individuals out of Brazil who are tracking mining tailings runoff from local gold mines, and they were using the CTDs to kind of trace the chemical plumes coming from these terrestrial gold mines. And, the mining companies certainly don't want you out there monitoring those things. And so releasing that information before you're ready it could be dangerous, like physically, personally dangerous to them. So we don't have like requirements for data sharing or anything. It's all, if you build a CTD, if you have one of our CTDs, it's your CTD and your data to do with as you see fit.
Then before we get into the topic at hand, let me ask you, where does the name Southern Fried Science come from? I always assumed that you were somewhere in the southern U.S., so I'm surprised to learn you're the Northeast coast.
So I'm in Maryland, which is a southern state. It is the northernmost of the southern states.
Is that right? I mean, okay. I won't argue this. I'm
so there's a
of
much
two countries, neither of
longer
which are.
There's a much longer argument to be had about the fact that Maryland is in fact the most southern state, but that is this is not a history of the U.S. Civil War podcast, so we don't have to get into that. But my argument is that because Maryland is the state that came the closest to realizing the promise of Reconstruction after the Civil War, it is in fact the only true southern state. But I started Southern Fried Science when I was living in North Carolina, and so we were in the South. We were in North Carolina. All of our writers were based in North and South Carolina and Georgia. The blog started in 2007, so it's been going for 19 years now. We've all moved around quite a bit since then, but I love the name Southern Fried Science, and I think it conveys a little bit of the casualness with which we want to communicate science to the public. It's an approachable name. It's the kind of name that doesn't immediately scare people away if they see oh, they're going to be talking about chemical oceanography or shark conservation. It kind of captures a bit of our casual and irreverent tone. And so I'm going to stick with it. And of course, it was created in North Carolina. I did my PhD in North Carolina. I was fried in the South. Just because I've moved on since then doesn't mean I'm not still Southern fried.
Fair enough. Okay, then I want to hear about your experience testifying in front of Congress. How did you get invited there? Is that the first time you've been invited there? And what's that like? What's the process behind that like?
Yeah, so this was my first congressional hearing. I have done some congressional briefings in the past, and that is how they found out about me and how they knew I was local to them. So I did in 2025, I did a congressional briefing with a few other individuals on the environmental impacts of deep sea mining. And that was an open briefing. Briefings aren't like hearings. You're not sworn in. It's much more casual. The elected representatives don't actually show up, just their staffers. So you're really talking to a room of 23 and 24-year-olds. So it's a much less stressful kind of process. But that's how I ended up on the radar of the House Democrats on the Natural Resources Committee. And so they invited me to testify at this hearing. This hearing kind of came out of nowhere. Like there wasn't a lot of lead up to it. It was announced with like 2 weeks to find witnesses, and it was announced by the House Republicans. So the House Democrats were caught a little off guard. And I'd like to pretend that like, oh, it's my vast expertise and my incredible reputation and like how very well spoken I am in front of a crowd of congressmen. But I think the reality of the situation is that I was probably the deep sea ecologist that lives closest to Washington, D.C. that could be available with 2 weeks' notice to testify in front of Congress.
I do have a friend who had been on deck for testifying in front of Congress, but he's from Canada and refused to consider traveling to the States, speak to the Congress people at this point in time. So
that is not a irrational choice to make right now. It is. I would not want to be traveling in and out through U.S. Customs, especially right now with DHS shut down.
What's the purpose of a House committee hearing like this? No, I wonder, like, are they trying to determine policy? Do you feel like you're making a difference there? What do you think is the reason for this?
So this is very much an informational hearing. They wanted to get testimony on the record about various aspects of the industry. I'm not under any illusion that like my testimony is going to sway the House Republicans one way or another. I think the important thing is that once it's on the record, once it becomes part of the congressional record, that then informs future legislative agendas. So The reality of a hearing like this is, for the Democrats at least, they wanted to get mining company CEOs on the record for specific details of their operations. For the Republicans, they wanted to promote they're trying very hard to develop this industry very quickly, and so they wanted to promote it. And then there's, it's one of these things where it's kind of a long tail. Like the testimony you give at these kinds of hearings, unless it's like a big like the Jack Smith hearings were happening at the same time, which was, regarding the Trump investigation into taking classified documents. That's the kind of hearing that can have much more immediate ramifications.
Yeah.
But a thing like this is really to get data on the record so that they can make informed decisions as they develop legislation.
So I'm going to read a couple of your statements.
Sure.
The first thing that I picked up on in your testimony: not an absolutist against all forms of deep sea mining, polymetallic nodule mining in particular has promise. Yeah, can I get your kind of explanation on the reason that polymetallic nodule mining has promise as compared to the kind of other sorts of deep sea resources? And can you explain why you're more open to this aspect as opposed to SMSs or crusts?
Yeah, so I think there's a scale issue and there's an endemicity issue that both come into play. So, we'll start from, let's go smallest to biggest here. When you're looking at seafloor massive sulfides, which are hydrothermal vents, they represent an incredibly small portion of the seafloor. So if you look at the total surface area of all known hydrothermal vent deposits in the world, both observed and suspected, so the ones that we've just found from plume studies, the total area is the same as the size of the island of Manhattan, and that's ocean-wide. So these are incredibly tiny ecosystems, and in addition to them being very tiny ecosystems, they're very, very novel. So hydrothermal vents, of course, are where chemosynthetic ecosystems are found. You get these giant tube worms. If you're on the East Pacific Rise, you get these very weird snails in the Western Pacific that are covered in hairs. You get in the Indian Ocean, you get these iron-footed snails that grow their shells out of a matrix of iron and calcium carbonate. In the Mid-Atlantic, you get giant swarms of shrimp. But the key feature there is that the animals that live at hydrothermal vents can't live anywhere else. And so you have these ecosystems that are incredibly vulnerable to disturbance, incredibly small in scale, ecologically bizarre. So we don't really see these kinds of incredible, abundant chemosynthetic ecosystems anywhere else. They differ quite radically by region. So, it's not the case where like hydrothermal vents are kind of uniform across an entire ocean basin. Every hydrothermal vent is functionally a very different ecosystem from every other hydrothermal vent. And so, when we look at the risks of mining and the risks of environmental impacts at a hydrothermal vent, it's significantly higher than even something like a ferromanganese crust on a seamount, and certainly higher than a nodule field in the Abyssal Plain, where we're talking about hundreds of thousands of acres of area, with ecosystems that they're not completely uniform, but they're much more uniform across a much larger area. So I think in terms of like putting together a management regime, thinking about how you can preserve some of that natural biodiversity while still exploiting the resource, I think is much more difficult on a seafloor massive sulfide, especially because the sulfide is the ecosystem too. Like the chemical process that creates the ore is the same chemical process that creates the ecosystem. So there's no way to remove the ore without removing the ecosystem at a hydrothermal vent.
Okay, well then I guess it's worth mentioning or worth talking about how far away, because no one's anticipating mining a hydrothermal vent. Everyone is quite clear that the mining is on extinct vent fields that are now, some distance away from.
Oh, well, that's not true. Sawara 1 was an active hydrothermal vent field. That's the only deep sea mining site that ever received a commercial mining license. The hydrothermal vents on the Indian Ocean Triple Junction are active vent fields. They're not just looking at inactive vents, they're looking at active vents as well. So I think it is very much true that there are companies exploring options for active hydrothermal vents. I know the proposals in Norway were focused predominantly on inactive vents, but people hear inactive vents and they think that means that the vent is extinct, that it's dormant, that it's shut down. Inactive vents are still... that just means that the major geologic activity is currently not happening. So there's not active venting. They're still part of, they're still connected to the magma chamber. They're still part of an active vent field. They can be far away from that vent field, but there's still some chemosynthetic activity happening. There's still remnant populations, and there are unique ecosystems that form on these inactive vents as well. In some cases, even more vulnerable because the energy source isn't there. I don't think it's true to say that an inactive vent is just no longer a vent. It's a different part of the successional process of hydrothermal venting. I think what people like to think about is dormant vents, and those are ancient vent fields that have now drifted off axis and are no longer part of the magma chamber. And so they now have the overburden that comes as sedimentation comes down. They're much harder to detect because they don't have plumes to find chemically. But if you're talking about a completely and truly dormant vent that's not part of the same geologic process anymore, yes, then that is a different story. But even in those cases, the minerals in those hydrothermal stockworks begin to break down, and you get processes like serpentinization, where you get heat generation and chemosynthetic activity coming from the geochemical breakdown of the ore body as well. So you still get weird, unique ecosystems down there. You get very strange, very interesting things. We actually have been mining off-axis dormant hydrothermal vents for 7,000 years, because if you look at the history of copper mining and the history of gold and silver mining, a lot of the earliest mines are on ophiolites, which are ancient pieces of ocean crust that have been uplifted onto land. The island of Cyprus, where you can argue that the Bronze Age was born, those copper mines are all 100-million-year-old hydrothermal vents, to the point where they found fossil tube worms inside the copper mines that they didn't know what they were until 1977, when we found hydrothermal vents on the East Pacific Rise. And all of a sudden it was like, oh, aha, these fossils in Cyprus are almost identical to the riftia tube worms we see in the East Pacific. If you want to mine a truly dormant vent, there's lots of terrestrial options.
There's, I guess, a couple hundred kilometers away from where I'm here in Trondheim, Norway, is one of Norway's oldest copper mines in Røros, and I've had to explain to me that was originally a seabed hydrothermal vent that is now on the top of a mountain in Scandinavia. Okay, so extremely interesting. I didn't know that people were talking about mining of active vents at all. I guess I had heard enough people kind of push back against the claim that they're going to mine active hydrothermal vents, and say, no, we're only going to do the extinct or dormant. And I've heard people argue over whether the word extinct can apply here. But I guess I had just assumed that was what was at least the most reasonable, and so the settled approach. Interesting that that's not clearly the case. And then I'm hearing that kind of, for you, the main simple criteria is just how unique is an ecosystem when it comes to exploiting resources wherever. It's like, if we're going to go ahead and damage somewhere, we want to make sure that there's somewhere else similar to that place that we're not damaging.
Yeah, so it's less that and more the question of how resilient the ecosystem is, and how easy it would be to establish appropriate set-asides that capture the biodiversity of that ecosystem. If you're mining a nodule field and you're looking over hundreds of thousands of acres, you can say, okay, we're going to look for areas of particular environmental interest, and we're going to create environmental set-asides, and we won't mine those. So we have regions that are held in reserve that capture the same biodiversity that we see in the broader nodule field. And so I can see a management regime that moves forward in that framework that works, that is respectful of the marine environment, and that isn't going to cause, catastrophic loss of biodiversity. With vents, because it'd be nearly impossible to capture the biodiversity of any one vent with another vent, because they all are so different when you start looking down into the nuts and bolts of how they function. I think it becomes untenable from that framework.
When you think of an ecosystem being resilient to mining in the deep sea context, is that just a case of having the capacity to set aside part of that ecosystem that is not going to be touched? Tell me what you think about kind of the capacity for deep sea ecosystem to actually be resilient to the kind of disturbance.
I use the word resilient because it's a conservation term. And when we talk about resilience, we're really talking about, how do we build a management regime that promotes resilience? And that means, preserving biodiversity. And preserving biodiversity in the deep sea context is going to be almost certainly in establishing set-asides. especially with polymetallic nodule fields, because one of the arguments I made in the hearing is that we should consider the impacts we make to the abyssal plain permanent, because these are they're very homogeneous ecosystems. They're very stable over centuries to millennium. All of the biologic and ecologic processes and geologic processes on abyssal plains are slow. And so over human lifespans, impacts to the seafloor, we're likely not going to see them recover to pre-impact states. And so I'm not in a position where I can say, oh, if the impacts are permanent, we should never mine. But it's the impacts. If the impacts are permanent, we need to build our management regime around that assumption and not be saying, oh, it'll recover in 30 years, or, oh, 30% of the species are back in 25 years. Like, no, the permanently impacted ecosystem, we need to be building our management regime around the idea that we should capture the diversity that we have the potential of losing in other places and ensure that we are not creating so much impact across a wide enough area and so much chronic impact that there's no chance of, not that there's no chance of recovery, because recovery is not possible, but that we don't lose what is represented by the area that we've impacted across the whole of the ocean. And I think with abyssal plains, because they're so vast, because there's so much area and there's a plenty of capacity to create set-asides. I don't think there's the totality of all mining proposals currently extant and companies trying to do it, I don't think could touch a fraction of the seafloor yet. We're in a position where we can really establish very good management regimes before mining happens that reflect and respect the marine environment and can be adaptive in a way that we can start, monitoring the long-term impacts and changing as we go to adapt to what we see as the changing impacts of deep sea mining as the industry ramps up, if the industry ramps up. Because I'm not an absolutist against deep sea mining. I also don't think it's inevitable. It's a high risk, high reward industry that they've been trying to get off the ground for 70 years now, and it is, working at sea is a monumentally difficult undertaking. It would be by far the most logistically complicated industry probably ever launched on this planet, at least.
Where do you feel we are, or anybody is, in terms of having that knowledge about where is an area that can reasonably start being mined now? Is there anywhere that we can say, okay, we know enough about this area that we can mine here and have that particular set aside? How far away in the horizon do you see that in terms of a responsible approach?
Well, so there's a few things to factor in there, because the best studied area right now is the CCZ. And I would argue that it likely is where the industry will probably start. But there's still a question of scale there. I think we've done enough in terms of understanding environmental baselines and in terms of doing environmental impact assessments to be able to say, okay, maybe it's time to do a small scale test mine, not at the full scale of a 3 megaton per year mining site, but we're not going to learn more about the impacts until we start doing the next commercial test. I think we're at a point where some mining firms might be able to argue that it's time to scale up and look at the impacts from scaling up, but it's still a stepwise process. So, we're not at the point where we're ready to mine the deep sea until we're at the point where we're ready to mine the deep sea. And we certainly aren't there yet. And we also aren't there technologically yet either. If all the rules and regs were in place and all the permits were done and you said, okay, mine tomorrow, no mining company would be able to mine tomorrow. We still have time, and we have this rare opportunity. This is really the first major extractive industry that we, the collective human we, have ever created, where we've gone in with environmental regulations first, where we've had this much time to really understand the ecosystems before we've allowed exploitation to occur. And man, it would be a shame if we got this far and then just right at the finish line, we're like, all right, all bets are off. Let's see what happens. When we really have a chance to build the future of resource exploitation for here and, and beyond here. One of the arguments I make is that, the precedent set by the International Seabed Authority about extracting resources beyond any nation's border is going to set the precedent for future extractive industries, some of which we haven't even imagined yet, some of which we have, asteroid mining, maybe Elon Musk will finally go to Mars and start bringing back Mars rocks to feed the hungry or something. The next generation of resource exploitation beyond national borders is going to be, space is a real possibility in the next 100 years. And we're setting the precedent now. Why don't we take the time to get it right? Wouldn't that be incredible? Fingers crossed. I've always been an idealist. Sometimes I come across as fairly cynical, but I've almost always been an idealist.
Well, I do want to get your thoughts on recent developments and whether or not we're taking a step in the wrong direction. But I guess I'm going to save that for a little bit later. As far as the biodiversity of the abyssal plains, if we can just stay there. So
Sure.
You said in Congress, the deep abyssal plain is more biodiverse than tropical rainforests with more unique species and genetic novelty than almost any other ecosystem on the planet. I was frankly surprised by that. And so I want you to put some color to that. Is the deep abyssal plain really more biodiverse than any rainforest? What are you saying there?
So sure, you shouldn't be surprised. There's two factors happening here. One is that the deep abyssal plain is almost half the surface area of the planet. So we're talking about an absolutely vast region of this planet. And two, one of the most powerful drivers of speciation, if we want to get, deep into the evolutionary biology weeds, is distance. So if you have access to a vast ecosystem, you have this ability to generate huge amounts of biodiversity. Where the abyssal plain differs from the rainforest is in biomass. So you have a tremendous abundance of species, and you have a powerful engine for speciation, which allows all of these organisms to differentiate just across distances. But the actual abundance of individuals is very low. So you have very high biodiversity and very low biomass. And so that actually creates a situation where any given species on the abyssal plain is incredibly vulnerable to extinction because they all are represented by relatively few individuals. And that also raises questions about, what is the right measure of biodiversity in the ocean? The conservation and management is a terrestrial industry. We've built our management regimes. We've built our ideas around biodiversity on terrestrial ecosystems. And the reality is terrestrial ecosystems are outliers. The vast majority of biodiversity, the vast majority of biomass is in the oceans, and in particular in the deep oceans, and in particular in the deep biosphere. So crustal microbes and nematodes and lots of organisms like that. And, when you get to the surface of the planet, we're the weirdos. All the strange stuff you find at the bottom of the ocean, that's normal. You and me and like giraffes and Bengal tigers, that's the weird stuff on this planet. We think about biodiversity in a very terrestrial context, and we think about conservation in a very terrestrial context. And I don't know if that's the right framework for the deep ocean. I think we're building out ideas about deep ocean biodiversity and about, how you think about what diversity is at different levels. Because, when we manage a terrestrial ecosystem, we think about species. And we think about species as the unit of conservation. And species extinction is the outcome you absolutely want to avoid. There are entire phyla in the deep sea that don't exist in terrestrial ecosystems. And pretty much at every taxonomic level, you have clades, taxonomic groups that occur in the ocean, do not occur in land. I think there's a single major taxonomic clade that occurs on land and not in the ocean, and that's onychophorans. And no one knows what an onychophoran is. It looks like a weird caterpillar. It's an incredibly basal, not quite. I'm not even going to speculate because I'm not an expert on onychophorans because I do ocean stuff, and it's the one thing that's not in the ocean. But we get into the deep sea and we have weird things like xenophyophores. You've got paleodictyon, which we don't even know what paleodictyon is yet, but we're studying how it recovers after mining impacts. You've got the deep microbes that are very poorly quantified, and you've got ecosystems that we're only beginning to discover right now. So, it's a hard question. I don't have any hard answers for how we manage for deep ocean biodiversity. It's a vast and complicated question. and we will almost certainly get it wrong. And it's okay to get it wrong as long as we have adaptive management frameworks where we can say, okay, we need to step back and tweak things. One of the big concepts I've been noodling around with recently about, what would trigger an all stop on a deep sea mining operation that's not like an accident. So not a spill, not like equipment failure or anything, but like what would require a deep sea mining operation to do a full halt based on
Yeah.
discovery on the seafloor. And if you look at the rate of novel ecosystem discovery in the history of deep sea exploration, we find a new hydrothermal vent level novel ecosystem about once every 10 years. So in the 1970s, we found hydrothermal vents. We found methane carbonate seeps. We found cold water coral reefs. We found whale falls. And recently, this Chinese expedition found the deepest known chemosynthetic ecosystem, which is a worm field at like 10,000 meters. So, at a rate of about once every 10 years, we find totally new and novel ecosystems that require us to step back and revise our understanding about how life functions on Earth. And that triggers, 30, 40, 50 years of scientific exploration. And those are significant findings that have significant environmental impacts, have significant economic impacts. So the discovery of deep sea hydrothermal vents, you can directly trace the development of the way we conduct modern medicine to the discovery of hydrothermal vents with both heat-resistant proteins, which allow us to do PCR and allow us to amplify DNA and trigger the genomics revolution, to kind of more conceptual frameworks like this idea of a holome, that an organism is not just your body and your genes, but also all the microbes that live inside you and how those interact with your body and your genes. That comes directly from the discovery of chemosynthesis at hydrothermal
Really?
vents and the discovery that these tube worms were housing chemoautotrophic microbes inside specially evolved organisms. So those are real important discoveries that we want to take a step back as a society and as a scientific community and understand. I think within 3 years of a full-scale deep sea mining operation coming online, so at one of these proposed 3 megaton operations, we'll probably double the number of observations we've made on the seafloor in human history. And that means to me the likelihood of a hydrothermal vent level discovery happening over the lifetime of like a 30-year deep sea mining operation is probably inevitable. And
So
so
even when we're talking crawling along the abyssal plain in the CCZ, where we've already done the most baseline studies of kind of anywhere, you still anticipate that running a mining operation there is just going to gather so much additional information.
Oh, they're going to find
even
new
in
stuff.
that,
Oh, yes.
yeah,
Oh, they'll find new stuff constantly. It's going to be incredible.
and really surprising new stuff, not just like a new variation on the kind of stuff that
Yes.
we've already discovered to be down there.
Yes, and I'm not saying that's going to happen all the time,
Yeah.
but I'm saying like over the 30-year life of a mining operation that's working over, hundreds of millions of acres of seafloor. Oh, they're going to find something. They're going to find something cool and new and novel that will probably have some significant implications for how we understand biology and the evolution of life on Earth. And if I were ruling the world, I'd be like, okay, well, if you find something weird like that, you have to stop. And we have to figure out exactly what's going on with that ecosystem and how it relates to the surrounding ecosystem, and if it's connected to other ecosystems and if there are other representatives of that before you can go any further. I don't rule the Earth, so I don't get to do that, but there should be some kind of a management policy in place that triggers the kind of stop that would allow us to take a step back and understand what's happening when we find something new and really novel.
I mean, that's extremely helpful, just kind of context in terms of wrapping my mind around what we're talking about, just on the concept of uncertainty and novelty. Is like, okay, we know as much as we know about this area, but if we just do this sort of simple activity, which is going to be essentially more of the same for 30 years, they're saying that the chances of finding out something incredibly novel is high. And so that tells me a lot that I didn't know about how much we know about what's there.
For all the effort that has been put into exploring the deep ocean, we've observed, like directly observed with eyes or cameras, less than 1% of it. Once we scale it, the thing that excites me about deep sea mining and that keeps me moving forward and not just becoming the curmudgeon that says we should never mine the deep ocean is this potential for discovery, because we're going to have so many more eyes on the seafloor and so much more opportunity to discover new things.
What about the capacity to monitor deep sea mining? What are your thoughts on that?
It's an expensive proposition, and at the moment, it's really the reserve of a couple of major countries that have large oceanographic research programs, as well as the mining companies themselves. There's a couple levels of monitoring. The direct seafloor observation for sure is something that we will expect from the mining companies, either through ROV feeds or whatever. They have to monitor their equipment anyway. We should have access to those eyes on the seafloor because it's a tremendous potential for discovery. But the reality of the deep sea is that most of the biodiversity is in the sediment. It's not something we're going to see from camera feeds. And so having continuous sampling regimes, having plans in place where we go back to sites, we take sediment samples, we take sediment cores, we really do a thorough job of assessing what is happening to the in-fauna is kind of essential, and that's a much bigger lift than just observing the ROV feeds. That requires, in some ways, I think that requires significant partnerships with academic institutions as well. The mining companies have the logistical capacity to get out there repeatedly, and the academic institutions have the scientific expertise as well as the credibility as independent observers to be part of it in a way where they can continue producing knowledge and also monitoring the potential impacts.
Well, this is optimistic to me, because I guess I've been up to now thinking that once a mining company starts out there, there's going to be no chance of really having a monitoring program over what they're doing, because it's just so remote. But also I had been thinking because there was no real incentive for anybody to be out on those ships. You're kind of telling me that there's going to be enough research value that we can put academic institutions out there with the mining ships. There'll be enough incentive for everyone to be out there together anyway. And that sounds like it's got the potential to set up to solve this monitoring issue. We can trust what the mining companies are doing because it'll be worth it for the academic institutions to be out there with them, and maybe everyone can play happily together.
Yeah, like I said, I'm an idealist. At some level, I think probably the mining companies are going to have to pay for a lot of that through grant making, or, in an ideal world where you're trying to create transparency and independence, the mining companies would have to do something like pay a royalty to the ISA or pay a royalty to the federal agency that's regulating them, and then the federal agency does grant making towards academic institutions out of that pool of money. So it's not the mining companies controlling who gets access to it. I think the reality is the academic industrial complex is going to be the dominant partnership. We've already seen it with MIT. We've seen it with me and Duke University and Nautilus Minerals, where the mining companies are directly funding researchers. And in some situations, they've been very, like, my relationship with Nautilus Minerals was very positive and very independent. They had no control over the research we did. They had no control over the priorities we set. They had no control over the data we published. The only carve out they got was they got to know 30 days before we published anything what we were going to say. They couldn't restrict it or limit it or anyway, but they at least got a heads up. That was a positive relationship. Nautilus had a lot of problems in a lot of other ways, but that relationship was very positive, and we ended up producing a lot of data that basically said, can't mine Solwara 1, shouldn't mine a hydrothermal vent.
Seems like everyone agreed your mic drop moment to Congress was the cheapest place to stockpile a nodule is to leave it on the seafloor. Now, I'm not very good at kind of doing the pushback side of the podcast host, but I'm going to try here. It seems to me that there's a lot of aspects to stockpiling nodules that don't get the advantages if it's on the seafloor. You don't have control and particular ease of access to the nodules. So I guess explain why you think it's best to leave those things down there for now, as opposed to get them at least a little bit closer to the mineral supply chains.
Yeah. So, and this was a test of testimony to Congress. So this is a U.S. specific statement. We don't have the refining capacity to process these nodules. Pick them up from the seafloor, put them in a giant pile at a military base. They sit there. They do nothing. We don't have the refining capacity. We should be investing in building out that refining capacity first. And I think more to the point, there has been some very compelling research recently that shows that we can meet a lot of the U.S. critical mineral demand through reprocessing of tailings from existing mines. And so if we have an urgent need to build refining capacity, and invest in refining capacity for resources that have not been exploited yet, we should be exploring all different kinds of refining capacities first. Stockpiling the nodules ahead of time kind of commits us to refining the nodules. And if we end up in a situation where there's actually a much more efficient refining process that gets us the same metals for much cheaper and from tailings from already impacted sites, then we just have a pile of nodules that are going to sit there until the end of time, and we might as well have just left them on the seafloor. I think when you don't have the capacity to do the refining, doing the collection ahead of time in the hopes that that capacity will happen is, a little preemptive and maybe not the best investment of time and resources. I agree we have a critical mineral crunch. I don't think nodules supplies as much as is promised by the mining companies. With nodule mining, we're really talking about three metals: manganese, cobalt, and nickel. A little bit of copper, but the copper's really not that compelling. From a U.S. standpoint, our allies produce a lot of those. It's the refining that's the issue, because China controls the vast majority of the refining process, and the U.S. has not had particularly good relations with China in the last year in particular. So, I feel there is a need to build that refining capacity, but putting it exclusively on nodules, which is now an unproven mining technology, as well as a new refining capacity or a new refining process is, a little preemptive. And I think the investment should be in refineries first and then finding the resources.
Yeah, well, here to a supply chain perspective to building out a mineral supply chain. The last kind of quote that I've got from you for this testimony: third, and in my view, most important, does the project have local support? So I think this is something that people who are coming to deep sea mining, what does local support mean when you're talking about the middle of an ocean, and why is it important?
Yeah, so in some cases, we're not talking about the middle of the ocean. This was also in response to the RFI about mining around the Mariana Trench. And that RFI area is very close to the island of Saipan, very close to the Northern Mariana Islands, which are inhabited islands with about 60,000 people who live there. There was an RFI for waters off the coast of American Samoa, which is, when we're talking about inside the U.S. context, it's within 200 miles of a coastline. And so, they're not out in the middle of the ocean. They are close to inhabited areas and places where there are people with cultural and personal and economic connections to those waters. These are communities that do an awful lot of fishing and whose most of their economy comes from the sea. So in those contexts, if you don't have the support of locals, if you haven't built inroads in the community, if you haven't developed some political will within the community, just from a practical, logistical standpoint, the project is going to fail. American Samoa is a good example. So if you're operating off the coast of American Samoa, you're flying into American Samoan airports. You're using American Samoan ports. You're using American Samoan hardware suppliers and equipment suppliers and service personnel. Your employees, when they have shore leave, if you're doing like a 2-week on, 2-week off rotation or any other thing, people aren't going to fly home from American Samoa. They're going to take 2 weeks in American Samoa on leave. And so they're working with hotels and rental car companies and all these other places. And if there's broad, near universal opposition to your industry from the local community, which in the case of American Samoa, I think it was something like 98% of all comments from American Samoa were directly in opposition. And it wasn't a few comments, it was 76,000 comments. All of that just becomes so much more logistically complicated, so much more difficult, and also just unpleasant. You're working in a community where you're constantly looking over your shoulder because you're not welcome there, because you haven't built the inroads ahead of time to really understand the community needs and build like a level of trust. You don't need to build 100% support for any of this. You just need to have like a mutual respect between you and the community and a mutual level of trust where you're not, constantly working against the entire legislative body of the country you're working in, and also doing the most complicated and logistically demanding industrial project in the history of the human race. I have a great on the ground example of that. So when I was with Nautilus Minerals, they were working out of Rabaul on the island of New Britain. And Rabaul was a former resort town. They had a couple of really nice hotels, and they had a big deep water port to bring in cruise ships. Rabaul also had a big volcano, which is why there were hydrothermal vents relatively close to it. The volcano erupted in the 90s, buried the entire town in ash. It's an eerie place to go. You can drive through the main town, and there's like a 2-3 meter high wall of ash that they dug the road out of. So it's a really fascinating place to be. But this deep water dock that was serving cruise ships became a major fishing dock. So every day, 30, 40, 50 people would go out to the end of this long pier and they'd fish, and they could catch deep water fish. Like on a good day, you could catch a tuna off a dock, which awesome. I'd love to do that. Nautilus had permission from the PNG Mining Authority to use that dock to stage their ship. And so they were using it to tender personnel back and forth. And they had a geology team that was being rotated off the boat. And they came up to the dock, and there were 60 people fishing off the dock. And Nautilus, there's no way to communicate back and forth. No one's sitting there with a radio or anything. There's no harbor master. So Nautilus just decided to pull the boat up onto the dock and drop their people off. And the guys fishing there were furious because it just ruined their day of fishing, disturbed everything. They got basically chased off the dock, and they were mad. Like, it is a crowd of 60 guys who had just been kicked off their fishing area. They were furious. And the geologists coming off the tender were too scared to get off the boat. So they came back. They came back to the ship that evening. And, that's the kind of thing that happens when you don't build good community support. And that, it's a small thing, but those small things just add up over and over and over to the point where it becomes like your entire logistics is just providing security for your personnel when it doesn't need to be. It certainly doesn't need to be.
Yeah, well, it's great to get just another aspect of the complexity of what we're talking about when we're talking about deep sea mining. It's complex from so many different angles. And so it's interesting to hear you kind of layer on one that I think most people don't consider. So let me just ask you my kind of standard trade-off question. To the extent that deep sea mining is often framed as forcing trade-offs across different kinds of values, do you agree with this framing? What values do you think are legitimately in play here when we're talking about making decisions about deep sea mining, and what values are being kind of smuggled in or ignored?
Oh, so that's an interesting question. So I think one of the most interesting things to me about the deep sea mining discussion, primarily when I'm talking to folks who are with deep sea mining companies who are doing deep sea mining work, they're on the environmental teams. They're doing the environmental impact assessments. But, the conversations around deep sea mining are on both sides motivated by largely environmental concern. That's changed a little bit in the current U.S. regime because it's now critical minerals and national security. But even when you're saying it's a national security argument and a critical minerals argument, it's critical minerals for renewable energy resources. Like, the reason these metals are critical is because we want EV car batteries and because we want solar arrays and offshore wind and all these other great things that you need metals to build. So it's just one step removed. But, the fact that it is an environmental discussion, the vast majority of people I talk with who are gung-ho about deep sea mining are also very concerned about the environment. And they see deep sea mining as a way of getting to a point where we're less reliant on fossil fuels in a form that is less harmful than other alternatives. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether or not it's truly less harmful or whether or not it will replace other alternatives. But, because it is fundamentally an environmentally motivated industry, I think there's a tremendous amount of goodwill between the people working in it, and also a tremendous amount of frustration. I mean, you're never more angry than you are with someone who you agree with on 98% of the issues and are fighting over those 2%. Like, so I think, that environmental aspect to it, I think, gets underreported. And it used to make me when I was running the Deep Sea Mining Observer, I got really irritated with when Secretary General Lodge was the Secretary General of the ISA, because he'd go and he'd do these interviews and he'd say, deep sea mining is a conflict between industry and environmentalists. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's environmentalists on both sides with very different visions for how the industry can and should progress. And I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, that's fascinating because I totally agree that that's been my experience, that there's so much agreement about the overall goal and then so much disagreement. I'm not always even clear. I mean, I guess the disagreement often comes about the approach and the weighting of values, and sometimes the disagreement comes over expectations of what's actually going to happen. We all agree that it would be better if deep sea mining was less ecologically impactful, or we all agree that it would be better if deep sea mining would offset certain types of mining that happens in the rainforest, and then the disagreement comes in over whether or not that's going to happen. And people say,
Right.
well, it's obviously going to happen. Or some people say, well, it's obviously not going to happen. It's going to be additive as opposed to substitutive.
Yeah. And I
Um,
tend to fall on that side, that it's an additive impact. Like, I've heard the economic arguments that, like, well, if deep sea mining makes these metals so affordable that they can't afford to do mining in the Congo or in Indonesia, but I don't find those arguments particularly compelling. I think if we genuinely and truly need all of these metals to transition away from fossil fuels, I've read history. I know people. We're going to grab every ounce of ore we can from
mhm.
every spot we can get it from. And I think it's naive to think that, like, nudge cobalt mining in the Congo out of the picture by economic forcing, especially when the ISA has, like, requirements not to adversely impact in terrestrial mining operation in developing nations.
So then are you casting a certain amount of doubt on the framing of this trade-off framing? I mean, sorry,
I
I've spoken with some people who say
yeah.
trade-offs don't exist. Like there's only kind of one overarching value and we should always be driving towards whatever that is. And to see a trade-off is just to not see the full picture. And that's not what I'm hearing you say. I'm sort of hearing you saying that trade-offs could be a thing, but actually for most people in deep sea mining, we're not so much trading off between environmental and economic or human values. We're all thrusting towards the same values. We're just disagreeing. And that's different maybe than a trade-off situation.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of the trade-off argument, I think of the arguments about, is deep sea mining better or worse than terrestrial mining? Can we focus on one versus the other? And in my view, deep sea mining is just a separate industry from terrestrial mining. It doesn't really impact terrestrial mining, at least in the current way it's structured, and it'll take many, many decades before deep sea mining could even come close to producing what the Democratic Republic of the Congo is producing in terms of cobalt. And so, it's an industry on its own. Deep sea mining has to stand or fall on its own merits, not on its comparison to other industries. In terms of, like, environmental trade-offs, in terms of, like, values trade-offs, I think there's a lot of shared values within the deep sea mining community. It's certainly not universal. There's definitely some people in deep sea mining who just want to get as rich as possible, as fast as possible, and more power to you. That's not the way I tend to move through this world, but it's certainly a way some people move through
Mm,
this world. And there's people who, I know there's a lot of folks involved in deep sea mining who are, they're technologically oriented. They're interested in the ability to develop robotic technologies and that kind of capacity. The ore is sort of an excuse to build the big
right.
robots. And I certainly find that view appealing as well. There's a lot of different values coming into play. I think there's some shared values. I think kind of the overwhelming value shared among everyone in the deep sea mining world, not everyone, but probably most people, is that, the deep sea is this vast, untapped wilderness on the earth, and it's untapped for mineral resources. It's untapped for biological resources. We've got the BB&J treaty now, so we've got this novel genetic diversity. There's the potential for discovery. There's all the other uses of the deep sea that we don't often think about but are there, like underwater cable laying and espionage and all this other fun stuff that happens at the bottom of the ocean. And so I'm saying that was a bit of a ramble. I don't really have an answer to your trade-off question.
Let me put some more words in your mouth.
Sure.
Um, maybe it's because you're an idealist or an optimist. You're looking at if this gets done the ideal way. I feel like one of the basic trade-offs that people talk about is kind of like the trade-off between now and the future, or the trade-off between the potential risk of doing something in an environment that we don't fully understand versus the kind of limited known benefits. Yeah. And so the words that I'm putting in your mouth is kind of like, well, as long as we do this right, as long as we go stepwise and only do as much as we kind of understand at any one time, we're going to mitigate that risk. But yeah, what do you think of that?
Yeah, so I don't think the risk ever goes away. But I do think, and like ideal world, we kind of collectively decide, no, the deep sea is too rare and too special and too wild, and we should leave some chunk of this planet untouched. If I was king of the world would function very differently than it currently does. I'm, also a pragmatist. I understand that my values aren't everyone's values and that we have to find compromises. I think there is, looking at, the current landscape of folks working in deep sea mining, there is certainly a potential for compromise where we can find a way forward for those who want to mine that has respect for the marine environment, that, those most opposed to deep sea mining are always going to be opposed to deep sea mining, but perhaps we can find some, a begrudging consensus is the term I like to use, a begrudging consensus of a way forward that is stepwise and adaptive and respects the marine environment. And I can see that. I can see that in the ISA negotiations. I know so many of the mining company CEOs like to complain about how the ISA negotiations are just being slowed down by environmentalists and are just like not proceeding as they should. And I don't think that's true. I've been following the ISA negotiations since 2019, and I've been involved in different capacities since 2008. And progress has been made. It's slow progress because this is a vast and complex international treaty involving 170 at this point member states that all have different values and see different ways to profit from deep sea mining and see different impacts. And so it's going to necessarily be slow. But I've actually, like, the environmental regulations that have been slowly developing at the ISA have not been stalled. Like, they're moving forward. They're moving forward very slowly, but there is a continuous negotiation happening over them. I think the grand mistake that the ISA has made is in having a unitary mining code. I think that if they had decided at the outset that there would be a set of regulations for polymetallic nodules, a set of regulations for seafloor massive sulfides, and a set of regulations for cobalt-rich crusts or ferromanganese crusts that were negotiated separately, we'd probably already have international mining regulations for polymetallic nodule mining.
Really? That's something I haven't heard before.
And the ISA recognized this when they did the exploration regulations. So there are separate exploration regulations for all three resources. They decided to do a unitary mining code, and I think largely it was because the member states who wanted to mine at cobalt-rich crusts, which I think at the time was Brazil. Brazil's a moratorium country now, but at the time they had their own mining interests on the Rio Grande Rise. And the countries that wanted to mine seafloor massive sulfides knew that if they split the three resources up, they'd probably never see a mining code for polymetallic sulfides or for cobalt-rich crusts because the nodules would happen, and then everyone would go gung-ho on nodules, and then you have a much easier, it's much harder to sell hydrothermal vent mining than it is polymetallic nodule mining. I think even if you were enthusiastic about hydrothermal vent mining, you'd acknowledge that it's a harder sell than polymetallic nodules. And so I think that unitary mining code has really slowed things more than anything else. And then the financial regime. The financial regime has made almost no progress since 2019. And that's like this weird, complicated argument for the common heritage principle where there has to be payouts to every state. And some states expect to get big payouts from the common heritage principle. And some states have mining companies and don't want to make any payouts to the common heritage principle because they're going to make all their money from mining. And some states have terrestrial mines and they want to make sure that the terrestrial industries aren't being adversely impacted. So, I think that financial regime negotiation is the real thing that's slowing down the development of the mining code. And I don't really know if they're ever going to find a consensus on that because there's so many different member states with so many different visions for how that payout's going to happen.
Yeah, that's a complicated topic. Maybe I'll later ask you to suggest someone that I can have on that topic because I feel like that deserves at least a podcast of its own to walk through. Okay, so you've been up till now pretty consistently optimistic about everything. Let me see if I can push you onto a topic on which you're less optimistic about. But the United States has recently been gesturing that they are going to start granting exploitation licenses under DSHMRA to areas beyond national jurisdiction. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on this development?
Yes, I do. Um, I think it's criminal. I think in that it violates U.S. customary law that has been established over the last 30 years in our deference to the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which we have signed but not ratified, which is a distinction that the policy people tell me is important, but I don't really see how it impacts things. It's an outrageous move, and I think it's an incredibly risky move on the part of the metals company in particular. I recognize that the position they're in is that they are a private company. They have a burn rate. They have investors, and unlike member states that are sponsoring their own mining companies like China and India and Russia and South Korea that can continue to support their contractors despite them not drawing any profit. These private companies, they need to have some return to their investors eventually, and they can't wait forever. So I recognize that is a position the metals company is in that is beyond their control, and they have to play the hand they've dealt. But the U.S. has deferred to the law of the sea for every administration since the treaty was ratified, with the exception of this one. This particular administration has violated the law of the sea in a number of different ways, many of which are far more egregious than the moving towards DSHMRA, which is a terrible acronym, impossible to say. The only thing harder to say than DSHMRA is the Deep Seabed Hard Minerals Resources Act, which was put in place before UNCLOS and has a provision in there that says it is designed to be supplanted by UNCLOS. So, I think even if there's a likelihood that the current administration will issue those mining licenses. And it's this combined exploratory and commercial license. The reality on the ground is that the metals company isn't going to be able to mine in 2 years. I think they're close, but I don't think they're 2 years close. And so they're going to, at the very minimum, they're likely going to have to deal with not the current U.S. Congress, but the next U.S. Congress, which all prevailing winds tends to show that it will be oppositional to the Trump administration. And then they'll likely have to deal with the next presidential administration. Having this be so closely tied to a particular administration's ideological positions, knowing that there is going to be, fingers crossed the U.S. continues to function the way the U.S. usually functions, which is that the political party in power in Congress will change hands in the midterms, and the next presidential election will be fairly reactionary towards the current administration. I think that puts all of their permits in tremendous jeopardy. And, I feel for them because they're playing the hand they're dealt, but I would not be hanging my hat on the Trump administration if I were building an industry that needs, another 5, 10, 30 years before it is fully in operation.
Aside from whether or not this is a good idea for the metals company and what's going to happen with the shift of U.S. administrations, what are the broader risks? What worries you about this in terms of just international governance? I know that was where my concerns sort of came from when I heard this news. I feel like we need to be pulling more and more together, and seeing places where we're pulling apart kind of made me the most nervous.
So I think if there's no administrative change, if they get permits to mine, if they begin commercial mining under DSHMRA, they lose access to the international market, is I think what largely happens. There are provisions within the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea which preclude them being able to create privileged markets for their metals from member states. I think many of the member states are going to push back and say, we're not going to take these metals. We're not going to let you land your nodules in countries other than the U.S. So if there's no refining capacity in the U.S., then they're just selling the nodules to the U.S. and probably not at a very good rate if no one's going to be refining them. I think the international implications are, maybe they lose their vessels and some of their logistics if, All Seas is not a U.S. company. The metals company is not a U.S. company either. So there can certainly be pushback from their home countries. But I think the biggest consequence is losing access to the international market and then becoming just a U.S. supplier.
What about the precedent that it sets in letting countries go outside of the ISA? Are you worried that China or India or whoever is kind of second to the mark is also just going to start doing its own thing, and this is going to lead to the disintegration of another aspect of international law?
I've actually been concerned since Well, since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, that we could see a breakdown of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, with major countries pulling out. And that risk at that point was perhaps Russia pulling out because they had been involved in significant violations of the law of the sea and were, part of the conditions of UNCLOS is that you're using the sea for peaceful purposes. I'm less worried about China pulling out of UNCLOS than I am about countries being like, we're going to push more towards exploring our own nodules in our own waters. I think that's the bigger likelihood. There tends to be like sort of a back and forth between international high seas mining and national jurisdiction deep sea mining over the last 30 years. There was a big push in the CCZ for a while, and then there was a pullback, and Brazil was looking at expanding its intercontinental shelf so it could do mining in its own waters. Papua New Guinea was obviously pursuing mining in its own waters. And we've seen in the last 15 years a push more towards high seas mining again with work in the CCZ and some of these other lease areas. There's been some push to do some work on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge as well. And then, recently with Norway attempting to get started mining its own waters, I think we're seeing a retraction again towards thinking about mining in local waters. So there's been this pendulum swing that's happened throughout the history of the industry. And I think we're on the swing back towards exploration in national waters again. And we'll see that for the next 5 or 10 years. Whether or not that bears fruit, I mean, the advantage of mining in national waters is you have one regulatory regime to deal with. Some of these countries have already created, the laws necessary to do the permitting, or in the case of the US, have made up something that farcically resembles laws necessary for permitting. And so on that hand, it becomes easier. But on the political hand of it, on the social licensing side of things, like now you're dealing with areas that are closer to populations, where you have more resource conflicts, where you have conflicts with offshore wind, and you have conflicts with fishing, and you have conflicts with other maritime industries, and you have people who just like their oceans and who can see what you're doing offshore because your boats have to come in and out. And so, the social licensing is harder, even if the policy regime is easier. So I think we're on that arc of the pendulum swing. Where that goes remains to be seen. When I started working in this industry 20 years ago, I was told by folks at Nautilus Minerals, including Gerard Barron, that deep sea mining was 10 years away. And that was in 2018. And, if you asked me today if I had to bet on when we'd start seeing commercial deep sea mining, it would probably be pretty close to 10 years today, too.
Okay. Maybe that's a good point to start winding down. Is there anything we haven't covered that you feel is worth mentioning?
Oh, this has been pretty broad ranging. I think we've hit most of my big topics. We didn't talk a lot about ferromanganese crust mining, and part of that is because no one's really talking a lot about ferromanganese crust mining. I think a lot of the economic assessments of those resources have shown that they're probably not particularly worth it. With the current state of technology and the current state of permitting. So the exploration of cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts has kind of slowed down quite a bit in the last 5 years. Brazil had been trying very hard to get the Rio Grande Rise added to its own exclusive economic zone, to its outer continental shelf, through Convention on the Limits of the Continental Shelf.
Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. There's too many acronyms. The world is an alphabet soup. They had a regime change, of course, and pulled out of the deep sea mining game. They're the only member state to date that had previously sponsored a deep sea mining company and had leases and surrendered their leases back to the ISA. Which I think shows a level of commitment that we haven't seen from other countries. France has a moratorium, but France is still maintaining its mining leases. The UN has not the UN, the UK has a ban, but the UK is still maintaining its mining leases. So, I think the fact that Brazil well and truly pulled out of its deep sea mining investments is a pretty strong sign that they don't see much value in cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts in the immediate future.
I don't understand this. What's the link between the UK government and the licenses that they hold in the CCZ? So I would have kind of said that those licenses they've been applied for by always a company with a sponsoring state doing the sponsoring. And so is it really within the government's remit to go ahead and cancel that?
So the sponsoring state is the one that sponsors the leases. So those are the UK's leases,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
they're given to their mining contractor. But it is, the mining contractor does not deal with the ISA. The sponsoring state deals with the ISA. The negotiations happen between the states, not between the contractors, which is why, at the last ISA meeting, there was this big, well, not big, but a small kerfuffle because the mining contractors wanted to create their own observer group so that they could intervene during the ISA negotiations on the part of the contractors on their
Hmm.
own. And the response back was like, no, it's the responsibility of your sponsoring state to intervene on your behalf. And so they didn't get their observer status that time. They may get it next time, depending on how the negotiations go. But it is, the licenses go to the country. And it is the sponsoring state who deals with the ISA. The contractors, once they have the contracts, I mean, obviously they're the ones submitting all the data and everything, but it is ultimately the buck stops at the sponsoring state.
Interesting. Why is it that so many sponsoring states are small island nations? I mean, it kind of seems like it initially makes sense geographically, and then you realize that it could be anyone sponsoring these things, and then you start to wonder if it's just because they're small and this is a great opportunity for them, or if it's something else. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's the structure of the Convention of the Law of the Sea. So there's a carve out in the Law of the Sea that says when you issue leases to, they have tiers of different countries and different member states in different country categories. And so functionally, it's when a wealthy Western or Asian country gets a mining lease, the ISA also creates a lease block that is available specifically to small island developing states and to developing countries. So
Hmm.
it is a carve out that recognizes, and the reason that these small island developing states are partnered with mining companies is because this specific carve out says, we recognize that the US can front a mining operation on its own. China can front a mining operation on its own. Russia can front a mining operation on its own. Nauru cannot front a mining operation on its own. So we've created this separate licensing regime that allows Nauru to partner with a commercial enterprise that can then mine. So it's actually the structure of the Convention of the Law of the Sea and the structure of the ISA implementation agreement that incentivizes small island developing states to form partnerships with commercial enterprises and to develop their own mining industries that way versus developing it through a state-sponsored company. And it's very
No.
confusing because it's like the member states are sponsoring states and also like state-sponsored companies, as in owned by the state, versus commercial enterprise that is not owned by the state but is sponsored by the state as the member state sponsoring a mining company.
Wow, I didn't know that. I feel like
Yeah,
I probably should have known that. But thanks for explaining that to me. Thanks
sure.
for explaining so much to me. And where should listeners go to get knowledge on the issue? Where do you think that is the best place for people to learn more about deep sea mining? And then where can people follow you and keep up with you?
Oh, best place to learn about deep sea mining right now. That's a tricky one. So the Deep Sea Mining Observer is still online. We're not actively updating, but there's about a 6-year archive of feature-length articles about the development of the industry that go up to about 2022. I'm on Blue Sky. So I'm Dr. Andrew Thaler on Blue Sky, and I maintain the Deep Sea Mining feed, which is a custom feed that tracks all of the posts across Blue Sky about deep sea mining. So if you want like the latest news, that tends to surface the most recent news the quickest. So I would
Tell
recommend
me,
follow me on Blue Sky.
has the social media landscape of deep sea mining bifurcated since the kind of major change to, well, since Twitter became X? Really? Like, I sort of imagine in the olden days, everyone would have posted everything on Twitter. And now I'm not on either X or Blue Sky, but I would just kind of assume that pro deep sea mining world would end up on X and the anti deep sea mining world would end up on Blue Sky because of just the sorting that seems to happen. So if you're on Blue Sky, do you get a balanced whatever feed? Tell me about the.
Yeah, so I mean, Blue Sky does tend pretty liberal and fairly progressive, and I'd say the vast majority of posts about deep sea mining are anti deep sea mining. That was true on Twitter back in the day too. So we used to do a regular back when Twitter's API was open and we could do like pool all the data and build social network maps and see who was talking about issues and track them. That was true there too. The vast majority of posts on Twitter were also anti-deep sea mining, and that's more a function of how NGOs work versus how industry works, right? Like if you're an NGO, your job is to sway public perception. So like job number one is putting out articles, putting out press releases, getting people talking about issues. If you're a mining company, your job is to develop an industry. So it is not your priority to be cranking out tons of tweets about stuff. It's your job to be building robots and working on developing permitting regimes. So, there's just a natural imbalance there, I think, and that's across any industry. The thing that makes Blue Sky interesting for me is that it is not an algorithmic service. So Blue Sky does not have its own native algorithm. When you started out, it's like Twitter in 2008. It's just a chronological timeline. But what it does do is it lets you build your own algorithms to track specific issues. And so I've built the deep sea mining algorithm for Blue Sky that basically tracks all mentions and conversations about deep sea mining. And so, yes, it will be generally biased towards folks who are against deep sea mining, but it tends to surface everything written about deep sea mining that appears on Blue Sky. And so it tends to be, whenever anyone shares any news articles, it tends to do a pretty good job collecting those. So, if you're on Blue Sky, subscribe to the deep sea mining feed and you'll get, it'll do all that searching for you and pull up whatever anyone's saying on the network about deep sea mining.
Awesome. Andrew, thanks so much for coming on, explaining all of this to me. It's been a privilege. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, to anyone listening, if you think these conversations are valuable and worth sharing, then please share. We'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you very much.